Kia ora tātou. Tēnā tātou katoa. Tuatahi e mihi ana ki ngā mana whenua. Koutou ko manaaki mai I ahau I roto I tēnei wā. Tēnā koutou. O te rā tēnei te mihi aroha ki a tātou katoa. Kia ora, everyone. What a lineup we've had over the last 2 days. And my thanks, AEC, my thanks, Ray, first of all. My thanks, AEC, for bringing us all together. And I think for giving me the last word. I'm not going to try to bring the threads of the conference together. You'll do that for yourselves. Janelle said she might leave it to me to smack your teeth out. And I thought, ooh, and then I thought, oh, well, actually, this morning, there's a couple of things I want to start with smack one. Is I'm unapologetically polarised, right? So it worries me when I hear us asking questions about how do we implement both the things we're trying to do. When we've heard about the side effects, and I know about the side effects, so I absolutely refuse to implement anything that is going to damage my mokopuna Māori. So no excuses. Smack two. I couldn't help but ask myself, I loved the students and everything they had to say. Did we have no Māori students in Wellington that deserved a place on our stage this morning? Okay, smack's over for now. Hannah said I might uplift you all. Well, no, sorry, probably not. But I did have to ask myself, what could I possibly offer at this late stage that might send you home with even more challenges? So picture this. It's the 7th of February, 1952. I had started school 18 months earlier, so do the maths, at Whangarei Primary School. And over the summer holidays, my whānau had moved to live in Pātaua, 30 k's east of Whangarei, where my father's bus would become the lifeline between the community and Whangarei. The bus was parked on the north side of the river, near the one-room Pātaua school. We were living on the south side. The day before, a Waitangi Day holiday, we'd practiced getting me to school in my father's boat, something I was to do, rain, hail, wind or sunshine, for several years. Very inconveniently, I thought, King George VI disrupted my eagerly anticipated first day at Pātaua School by dying in the early hours of the 7th of February, and schools closed in respect. Now, I've been scoping the room over the last 2 days, and I doubt too many of us, if any, are in a position to remember education that far back, or to have been actively engaged in it for as long. So my plan is to take advantage of my geriatric status and my long memory to remind us, and particularly our Minister of Education, just how many times we've been here before. Back at Pātaua School, in the one-room building, there were never more than 25 of us, from what we call Prima 1 to Standard 6. Most of the students were Māori. We either came to school by boat, or, as I did, or rode horses, which were kept in the school horse paddock next door. We sat at those heavy wooden desks with lift-up seats, wrote with pens we had to dip in an inkwell, inset into the desktop. One of my earliest jobs at school was refilling those damn inkwells every morning. Every morning without fail, we recited our times tables and our phonics chart, which had an animal theme. I can still see the pictures on that chart as we droned. A is for antelope, L is for llama. Antelopes and llamas, we'd never seen them, possibly never would, but we could chant them perfectly. That was education, that was literacy, English on a chart, for children of Ngāti Korora and Te Waiariki who had grown up on their own whenua, who knew who they were before their schooling experience intentionally changed that. It took me many years to recognise the vast white spaces in my education. At Pātaua School for 6 years, later at Whangarei Girls High School, in my teacher training at Ardmore Teachers College, or in my own early years of teaching. That lesson didn't hit home until my own children, who identify strongly as Māori through their father's whakapapa, entered secondary school. But that one room at Pātaua, filled with brown kids, was my first glaringly white space. A space where whiteness was the air we breathed but never named, where Māori children learned that the world that mattered was somewhere else and someone else's. 73 years later, the antelopes and llamas are back. They've changed their names, structured literacy and maths, the science of learning, knowledge-rich curriculum, back to basics, achievement crisis. But make no mistake, they are still antelopes and llamas. It's the same white space, just with a new layer of white paint. A few weeks ago, Liam gave us this perfect 176-word explanation, I'm sure he's rewriting that, of the curriculum progress made by our current government. Many of you in the room have protested against the changes being pushed through by a government and a minister who, to use Liam's perfect description, sits on a stage at an event hosted by a far-right think tank in the US and, echoing the language of Elizabeth Rata, says that cultural responsiveness is a misdiagnosis. And as I read Liam's points, those antelopes and llamas jumped out at me again. Look at some of those changes and decisions. We've been there, done that before, and as Julia said this morning, I was there. In my own secondary schooling at Whangarei Girls High School, at the age of 12, I sat entrance tests that funneled me into the professional stream, completely reversing my experience at Pātaua, because all the Māori girls ended up in what was called the commercial classes. Nothing to do with economics or business, just learning how to type, take shorthand, be of service. Those labels and those expectations followed us throughout our secondary schooling and into our working lives. And both Hannah and Janelle explained that traumatic history for Māori learners. So do you think, Erica, that throwing out NCEA because you don't understand it as a parent, in the secondary school I led, the parents understood it perfectly, by the way, and replacing it with a process where students have to pass 4 out of 5 subjects, where their results are graded out of 100, is a new idea? No. In 1960, I passed school certificate in 5 subjects, scraping through with just 53% in maths, a C grade back then, when 52.5% was the scaled pass rate for maths. And I watched many of my friends locked in to having to repeat the 5th form until they passed. It was demoralising then, and it will be again, as young people fail their foundational skills, literacy and numeracy assessment in year 11 and get siphoned off at 15 or 16 years of age into vocational courses just like in the 1960s. And which young people will be the most affected? That's right, Erica, not your mokopuna. In 1961, I had my university entrance qualification accredited. No exams, Erica and Michael. It might have worked for me, but it was still a white space, where this Pākehā girl from Pātaua learned Latin, French and German and went off to teachers' college, and most of the Māori students I grew up with just left school and went home. That was exactly the reason for the introduction of NCEA. School certificate was an exam-based, one-size-fits-all approach. and university entrance exams created a bottleneck that many students, particularly Māori, couldn't get through. Young people were leaving school early, unable to find jobs, ill-equipped for the transferable skills required in a technological world. And of course, it has flaws, but NCEA has enabled my fluent Māori-speaking mokopuna, both boys and girls, Michael, to achieve degrees. Degrees in teaching, in performing arts, to run successful businesses in media production, to lead organisations, to travel all over the world, become content creators, producers, directors, consultants, artists, tattooists, maurako exponents, and athletes, where their bilingual skills in Māori and English are their greatest strength, unlike the languages I learned and have never used. And that creative depth and breadth will never be delivered by a narrowed return to the 1960s. So let's take a closer look at the current intentional erasing of anything Māori from our education landscape. That too is nothing new. The deliberate removal of Māori from education policy and thinking was implemented following the Hun Report in 1961, 2 years before I started my teaching career at Hikurangi Primary School in Te Taitokero. Still oblivious to the white space I entered and became complicit in replicating. The Hun Report was the first official document to make explicit the disparities between Māori and Pākehā. So, no, Erica, this isn't something you newly invented in 2024 and decided you'd call it a crisis. And guess what? The government's response then was just like yours now. Hun failed to question the moral legitimacy of an education system that steered Māori away from professional careers and into manual labour, nor did he acknowledge that structural inequality and unequal power relations lay at the root of the issue. Instead, he simply recommended replacing the policy of assimilation with one of integration. Never mind what Dr. Ranginui Walker called the whakapapa of the gaps, the relationship between power and knowledge, and the role of the state in generating what counts as knowledge. Under the policy of integration, Hun proposed that something he called evolution would integrate Māori and Pākehā so rapidly that in 2 generations the process would be nigh on complete. There would be some preservation of Māori culture, but most of it, he decided, had already departed, and only the fittest elements would survive. So let's make no mistake, integration meant erasure. In the year I left Teachers College, ready for my first year at Hikurangi, along came the Curry Report. For the first time, officially rejected the idea that there was a difference in intellectual potential between Māori and Pākehā, but doubled down on deficit thinking nonetheless, with its conclusion that too many Māori children live in large families in inadequately sized and even primitive housing, lacking privacy, quiet, and even light for study. Too often there's a dearth of books, pictures, educative material generally to stimulate the growing child. But are we really done with deficit thinking 63 years after Curry, Luxon's condescending advice over the school lunch fiasco, and his recent get off the couch and stop playing PlayStation would say we're not? The talk from this government of raising Māori achievement is code for fixing Māori learners, not fixing the system. It echoes the thinking of American academic E.D. Hirsch, as we've heard, whose 1996 book, The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them, argues that to help children from underprivileged homes, schools must directly teach them the knowledge which the children of privilege gain indirectly at home. In other words, working class and Māori children are seen as blank slates, waiting for schools to fill their supposed cultural void. That's deficit thinking disguised as educational science. The very theory, Erica, that you proudly called the complete foundation for your curriculum reforms. On stage at the No Boundaries, Just Possibilities conference, you embarrassingly fangirled E.D. Hirsch, brandishing his book, the one you said you read on holiday at the beach, as your inspiration. That same book that positions Māori and working class knowledge as something to be replaced, not respected. Back in the 60s, the fear of a Pākehā backlash to two outcomes from the Hun report, the establishment of the Māori Education Foundation and the National Advisory Committee on Māori Education, was real. Sound familiar? Because it should. Today we see the same backlash dressed in modern neoliberal language. Hobson's Pledge, the New Zealand Initiative, we saw more than enough of that yesterday. Rata, Seymour, Luxon, all desperate to reassure their privileged right-wing libertarian voting base that Māori success must be managed within their white comfort zones. Ranginui Walker writes that in the 1970s, to circumvent opposition to the insertion of Māori language and culture into the school curriculum, Māori intellectuals redefined assimilation and integration as taha Māori. And Dr. Wally Penatito asked, if taha Māori is the answer, what is the question? And there I was in the 1980s at Clover Park Intermediate in Otara, in South Auckland, leading the development of the first taha Māori unit at an intermediate school anywhere in the country, and thinking I was doing a great thing, with no idea that there should be a question. As I said, complicit in and blind to my own white spaces. See, I was perfectly capable of reciting my Pātoa school phonics chart and my times tables by rote. Yet in spite of the fact I was a minority at Pātoa, nothing in that education opened my eyes or my mind to racism, integration, assimilation, multiculturalism, taha Māori, the tools of colonisation. It was all antelopes and llamas, no different to the situation we have now. Meanwhile, Māori parents who have never stopped protesting were building kohanga reo on marae floors and demanding kura kaupapa Māori without government support. They weren't asking to be included in the white spaces, they were creating their own. And let's remember, at that time, Elizabeth Rata, who is Pākehā, was a member of the original Kura Kaupapa Māori Working Party and the secretary of the combined Kohanga Reo whānau seeking to develop continuation for Māori language learners graduating from Kohanga Reo. Dr. Leonie Pihama writes, we need to be clear that using some distorted idea of academic scrutiny to enable constant attacks on Māori initiatives and to undermine Māori educational movements and all that support those movements is not acceptable. For those aware of the background issues in regards to Elizabeth Rata's engagement with Kura Kaupapa Māori, it's easy to see that these discourses are grounded in what I would call a politics of resentment. That's the same Elizabeth Rata who has personal and commercial interests in the professional development she delivers in her knowledge-rich approach, who criticises the indigenisation of our universities and was one of the 7 white signatories to that infamous Auckland University's letter that opposed parity for mātauranga Māori with other bodies of knowledge in the school curriculum, particularly the science curriculum. So I have to ask Erica, seriously, if Rata and yesterday Johnston are your answers. It's terrifying to think what your question is. But I have one. Can you explain to me how this sort of racist, misogynist influence is not only advising education policy, but actually writing curriculum can possibly benefit my mokopuna Māori? Fast forward to my first principal's job in 1994, 5 years after the major 1989 reform of tomorrow's schools that introduced a system of neoliberal self-managing schools, shifting administrative and financial power, as you know, to local boards of trustees. Yes, we became managers, accountants, data-driven, competitive, and business-focused. But those who now write the reviews and reports on its failure weren't teaching 100% Māori and Pasifika kids in Otara. The autonomy of tomorrow's schools gave the community of my school, for the first time, the power to shape learning that suited their children, that rejected the racist approaches they'd been subjected to as learners themselves. And over the next 20 years, we did just that, teaching the basics brilliantly, Erica. The basics of being Māori, or Samoan, Tongan, Cook Islands Māori. The basics of identity. The basics of developing critical consciousness to reclaim rights, to stand up for injustice, to speak out. The basics of whānau and community, to develop what we called warrior scholars. We used every tool tomorrow's schools put at our disposal to basically and brilliantly eradicate white spaces. The Parents' Advocacy Council, the process to change the status and class structure of the school 3 times, the contestable funding, the voice and power of a community. We deliberately broke many rules along the way, never losing sight of our end goal, to be different on purpose, because our Māori and Pasifika kids had the absolute right to an education that put their needs and their right to learn as who they were first. We built a whole new school, deliberately planned, Michael and Erica, to replicate the open plan modern learning environment of the original buildings built in 1980, because they were perfect for the learning we developed, centred on whānau and as close to home as we could get it. Stack that intention up against the current landscape that is hell-bent on removing Māori voice, Māori choice, Māori language, Māori environments from our education system and rebuilding those walls. Let's be honest, this has nothing to do with raising standards. It's about clawing back control of the narrative and the system to appeal to the elite. Back in 2013, I wrote to name the white spaces in our education system. We have to talk about white privilege and white supremacy without taking those terms personally. We have to ask the hard questions about the purpose of schools, whose knowledge counts, who decides on the norms we expect our youth to strive for, who decides on literacy and numeracy as the holy grail, an almost sole indicator of achievement and success. Those questions haven't changed. On my pātaua phonics chart, E was for elephant. So let's talk about the very white elephant in Erica's toolbox. That is literacy and numeracy, structured or not, and the manufactured crisis she would have us believe she just discovered all by herself. As we heard yesterday and have seen all week in the rewritten curriculum, Erica's solutions are more antelopes and llamas. The mandatory 1 hour, on average, of literacy and numeracy a day is framed as getting tough on failing schools, with the instruction that teachers will deliberately and purposefully dedicate time to teaching those core skills. What did she think we were doing already? So again, let's be clear, this is not redesigning at all. It's yet another example of a system doing exactly what it has always been designed to do, to create and even worse, tolerate a social hierarchy, inequality and inequity not far removed at all from our earlier policies of integration and assimilation that aimed to make us all the same, that is, all white. Once again, been there, done that. It's not a new fight, just a government using schools as a weapon in the process of recolonisation and assimilation. It's just one long loop. Erase, rename, repeat. If all we needed was a relentless focus on literacy and numeracy, why didn't it work when John Key's fifth national government implemented national standards between 2010 and 2017? Professor Georgina Tuati-Stewart calls the current reintroduction of testing, using euphemisms like checkpoints and phonic checks, progression monitoring, as the return of national standards by stealth, and labels the tests useless and clearly harmful to children. We know very well just which children were harmed by the national standards testing regime, not your mokopuna, Erica. Why won't your teaching the basics brilliantly work any better, Erica? Because it's teaching the basics brilliantly white and race blind. Anti-racism research calls out race-neutral policies that are endemic in the coalition government's decisions as failing to reverse the gaps and barriers that exist because of structural racism and as a threat to racial equity for Indigenous and minoritised groups. The research finds that only race-conscious policies that may disproportionately help Indigenous and minoritised groups can dismantle those structural barriers. And we know we won't see any of those anywhere in the coalition government's education policy. This deliberate elimination of so-called race-based policies by the coalition government to attract and placate their right-wing voter base simply says we couldn't care less about addressing racism and inequity. In fact, we'll not only happily encourage it, we'll hide behind seemingly benevolent but still racist statements about the common good and working for all New Zealanders. So what literacy does work? On the 19th of November last year, my oldest great-granddaughter Atareta stepped up to the microphone in front of Parliament buildings alongside the amazing Hana Rafiti Maipi Clark. And at 14 years old, to an audience of over 80,000 flag-waving protesters, this is what Atareta said.
Ko te kōrero ata he mihenare e ki ana. Ko ta whitirawa ka tātou haere, kia kaua e haere tonu. And as I think about those words, I can't help but say, I am Marika, yes. We have come so far, not to keep going. Okay. No reira, we have marched all the way from Hikumotika, and I watched my nanny march from Motupohui into Waipounamu. All of us are here marching, kia poitu te tiriti. But I believe we should honour and run, kia poitu te oranga korutanga o te Māori. Oranga iwi, a reo, a hauora, a tōranga tuahoki. As Rangatahi Māori, we are watching, we are learning. We are watching Hana Rafiti, and we're learning that as the youngest person in Parliament in the world, you can make people take notice. And then we're watching old people in Parliament that don't listen and don't change their mind. But we are watching young rangatahi who have helped organise this hikoi, and we are learning that we don't have to wait until we're older to have our voice. Hey Tawira, kakikima, if you're here today, but you have not registered to vote, ngā kura kaupapa Māori e toi tua I te reo. Ko te wero o te rāko tāku tono ki a tātou, I ask you to enroll and vote. I ask you to be on the Māori roll. E mātakitaki ana mātou, e whakarongo ana mātou. And we need you for today and for our āpōpō. Aha kua te kaupapa, aha kua te kāwanatanga o te wā. Ina koe tū te oranga, e kore rawa tātou e ngaro. He kākano tātou I ruia mai rangi āpea. Roreira, takahia te whenua, rukuhia ngā moana, piutia ngā maunga, me hāmama te karanga, he Māori ahau, e koi tū ana te ora, ake, 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 te ora tātou.
Now, how dare we think we can sideline mokopuna like Atareta in our education system? Think of Atareta's words not only as a challenge to members of parliament, which she did very well, but to us in our schools and classrooms. Our rangatahi on the hikoi, in their classes, in their homes, listen to powerful speakers, tangata whenua and tangata tiriti alike, and then learned about writing, submissions against the Treaty Principles Bill, learning skills of argument, persuasion, points of view, research, critical analysis, and increasing their vocabulary in te reo Māori and English. They learned what Paulo Freire called reading the world, that is, understanding the political context of your world before you can effectively read the word. That means, Erica, that reading is not about structure and decoding letters and sounds, but is dynamically intertwined with students' lives and realities. That's critical literacy. That's as Māori. But instead of understanding that, Erica, what did you do? You clearly demonstrated again how little you know about education when you said children should be in school and not participating in the hikoi. You showed us that again with your recent PR exercise about the unverified success after 8 months of your phonics regime. You see, in 63 years in education, I've never met a parent whose primary measure of success for their children was decoding words out of context. Until you, Erica. So in my long trip down memory lane, what can we learn from the lessons and mistakes of the past? You would hope we would learn not to repeat them, but clearly that's not the case. Unfortunately, there's one crucial mistake that we as a profession of educators keep repeating. I wrote this in a previous blog post and again, unfortunately, see no reason to change it. What frustrates me the most is our silence. Thank goodness for this collective and the writing and analysis of AEC members. And kudos too to the minority of principals who will choose to take a stand and either refuse to implement policy, that's what I would do, that will damage children, or who will at least adapt their implementation to suit their communities and whānau. How are we supporting them? Those principals and groups who stood up against national standards testing were targeted by a vindictive Minister of Education at great personal and professional cost. My daughter was one of those. And they will tell you they would do it all again in a heartbeat, but this time probably not so publicly. See, neutrality is a position. Silence is not neutrality, it's collusion. It's the choice we make to roll over and play dead and just allow racist changes to happen unchallenged. The unfortunate truth is when successive governments introduce change without any credible evidential base, when individual politicians and advisors misuse power and demand we jump to suit their flawed policy promises, the majority of us simply ask, how high? We might complain to each other, but inevitably we start implementing the change, aligning ourselves with the minority of educators who think they might work, when history and experience tell us they will not. As a profession, we seem unable to unite. So divided we fall. We tolerate, then perpetuate the harm that this direction will do to mokopuna Māori, and we accept that they will be collateral damage. So obviously only some of our mokopuna matter. And until that changes, we'll just continue to be complicit in the damage. And the greatest mistake we can collectively make is believing that the new reforms are an attempt to fix a failing system. They are an attempt to reassert control and normalise assimilation by erasing the hard-won gains in tiriti-led and Māori-centred education. We've been here before many times. And there are some heartening examples lately that show our collective strength. And of course, many teachers in this room and all over the country are putting in a huge amount of work. But the honest truth is it's not enough. It's not enough. And I know we're all busy. It's not enough. I know in this audience I'm preaching to the converted, but I want to leave you with an image that I encourage you to use as a mirror back in your own schools and organisations to reflect on your thinking and practice and to check if there are any antelopes and llamas still lurking there. Around the edge of this slide are the social transformation diagrams from an educator's guide to changing the world that I've used many times before. These 4 diagrams are aligned with the quadrant in the centre, a conceptual framework for determining our position on the axes from assimilation to whiteness decentered and racist to anti-racist. Starting at the bottom in the low quadrant, we have the status quo. Definitely the norm, where the white core is a central place of power, occupied in our case by Pākehā, and outside that core are all those we minoritise. It's a blatantly racist model with no intention of changing. In fact, currently doubling down on our racism and supremacy. Most of the current changes to our education system are firmly located in this box. Antelopes and llamas thrive and multiply in this space, and our mokopuna deserve better. Moving up to the top left, we have the liberal empowerment model. This is a privileged position where we pay lip service to reform that sounds as if it might decenter whiteness, but it never relinquishes control. Often here, we've got no clue about the realities of the children in the margins or the damage we inflict on them, as Hannah told us so eloquently yesterday. Here we talk about culturally responsive pedagogy instead of critical, culturally sustaining work. We hold equity, not sovereignty, up as the holy grail. And our goal, with a plethora of programs like PB4L, growth mindset, inclusion, grit, and yes, structured literacy and maths, knowledge-rich approaches that are all about fixing the kids, ignoring the fact we broke them in the first place. The liberal empowerment model is about improving the education of Māori and other groups we relegate to the sidelines by helping them move into the core. If they learn our rules, it's about teaching them to play our game, not about changing the game altogether. In this space, we expect all of our mokopuna to be antelopes and llamas. At the bottom right, I want you to pay great attention to the bottom right. We have the missionary or saviour position that unfortunately many of us get to, then stop. We're high on anti-racist rhetoric and intent, but low on actually decentering whiteness. And that's my challenge to us. How far are you really prepared to go? Because the antelopes and llamas lie in wait in this space. They hide in our definitions of success and achievement. And I've heard that over and over and over again over the last 2 days. They're even more entrenched in our curriculum now than they were before. They sneak out in our assessment practices. And although we often have the best of intentions, and I genuinely believe we do, we retreat back to our comfort zone that is still largely an assimilationist model. We mean well. The children in our margins might feel a little bit better, but we haven't shifted that white target much at all. And the fact remains that nationally close to 90% of Māori children are exposed to the damage that is caused inside that white core space, which, it's glaringly obvious, fails to meet their education needs and pretends not to understand how hegemony works to perpetuate the dominance of the core until eventually we think it's normal and we no longer question it. Any sort of inclusion of Māori learners into our white space cannot be anything other than assimilation. So if that's really still our goal, why don't we just say so? Solozano and Yosso assert that according to cultural deficit storytelling, which is what we're being fed under the guise of knowledge-rich reform, a successful student of colour is an assimilated student of colour. And if we genuinely want to make a difference, to reach that top right pluralistic quadrant, we have to be committed to moving from a deeply dehumanising racist education system to a proactively anti-racist, tiriti-led system, taking intentional action to counter racism, hegemony, privilege, and all the other barriers Māori learners encounter as they try to navigate our education system at every level. I'm going to let you read that, what we have to name, what we have to reject, what we have to challenge. And that last one, we have to challenge Eurocentric solutions that perpetuate the myth that white is right and come from the perspective my good friend Dave Stovall calls giving those poor people of colour what they so desperately need. Those of us who are not Māori have to do this work ourselves. It's not the job of Māori to undo colonisation or help us fix our racism or our privilege. Undoing colonisation is the job of the coloniser. That's us. On the other hand, re-indigenising the curriculum is not the job of white educators. Re-indigenising is the right of Māori to determine what matters for their children's education, to decide which cultural knowledge, language and values need to be prioritised in schools, and it's our role to get out of the way of that. In that top right social transformation diagram, we intentionally break the stranglehold of that white core to change from practices that are still colonial and racist to practices that genuinely recognise all knowledge as valid and equal and power is genuinely negotiated, navigated and shared. Māori must be able to determine the shape and growth of this transformation for our Māori learners. The top right box is the counter to scripted curriculum purchased from overseas, to programs that preach, as the United States did, no child left behind, that Native Hawaiian teachers aptly renamed No Child Left Brown. In the top right box, we've finally dealt to the antelopes and llamas, who now have a place no more important than any other knowledge, where A could be for antelope and or arero, where all our mokopuna matter. And when I think back to that one classroom in Pātaua and the children I grew up with, I realised it's not only about our mokopuna today, it's about honouring the generations that we've intentionally sacrificed to the antelopes and llamas in the past. In my whānau, as in countless others, it has taken 3 generations to reclaim the language and knowledge that was deliberately stolen. We are not going to let that go. You know, the thing about old age is it makes you grumpy. I don't agree this is a slow game or a marathon. It's beyond urgent, and I'm not prepared to let one more mokopuna wait one more generation while we get our act together. If all it takes to mandate massive change in our education system, Erica, is for you to read a book, well, I've got another one for you to read on your next beach holiday. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram X. Kendi argues that without the capacity for honest self-reflection and critical thinking, we'll continue to swear we don't have a racist bone in our body, all the while racism and white supremacy persist unchecked, destroying communities and lives. It's no longer acceptable to not be racist. We must be actively anti-racist, build anti-racist structures and institutions, and be actively engaged in learning how to do that. If your obsession with improving PISA, Pearls, TIMS outcomes is the answer, Erica, what is the question? Kendi has those. What if, all along, our well-meaning efforts at closing the achievement gap has been opening the door to racist ideas? What if different environments actually cause different kinds of achievement rather than different levels? What if our educational system focused on opening minds instead of filling minds and testing how full they are? And what if the way we measure intelligence shows not only our racism, but our elitism? What if indeed the bottom line is, as Peter told us, we are measuring the wrong stuff? The job of those of us who benefit from the white stream is to ensure, for the first time in our history, the education system from policy to classroom reflects the courage of our mokopuna, like Atareta, the courage to read the world and to take action to change it. But will we? Really? We've been there too often before. This has to be the very last time. Kia ora tātou.